Good day, ladies and gents. This is your boy Galapagos J here. Today we're going to talk about shimming. It is a very important step in making sure that your gearbox is reliable and will last a long time. Now, shimming can be a very time-consuming process, but it is very important that we take the time and patience in doing the proper shimming, especially if you're pushing your gearbox to much higher stress levels. So if you have like a I don't know, like M160 or M140 sort of setup, or even just 100, that is considered high stress for a gel blaster realm. So if you have that kind of setup, proper shimming is absolutely crucial to ensure that your gearbox or nothing happens to it. Now, at lower spring gauges, you can probably get a bit lazy with it because it's a balance between the consequence and also less time spent on shimming because for example, all the out of the box gel blasters that you get most likely don't have a lot of shimming straight from the factory. That's because at M70 or even M80 or something like that, the consequences of not doing proper shimming is basically minimum. Probably not even going to have anything happen to it. But if you're talking about very high stress sort of setup, then the consequences can be very, very bad. Like something like this, like this is what happened to me a long time ago when I was testing an M160. Actually, 140. It was only a 140, and I got a bit lazy without shimming. I think I missed about 0.2 millimeters, and I played with it for a week or two, like a couple of games and stuff. But then it all of a sudden I just heard some strange sounds, and the gearbox locked up. So gearbox locking up isn't something that is strange to me. Like it's happened to me many times. So, but every time the locking up is from a different reason. So this time I opened up. As you can see, it's the bushing got completely crushed. So yeah, in that sense, it's definitely to do with shimming because let me give you an example. Here's an example, right? I have a sector gear here. Now imagine it's inside the gearbox right now. So let's put two bushings on either side, okay? If you don't have proper shimming, it'll have space in between, right? Something like this. Now, for the sector gear, okay, this is actually the one gear without proper shimming that's the most likely to have problems with, because this is the gear that meets the piston. Now the piston sits with the sector gear like this in this direction, and it travels in this direction while the sector gear goes in this direction. If you don't have shimming, proper shimming, it is also possible for the sector gear to travel this way, okay, because it can rock left and right, okay. If you don't have any space in between the bushings, then it's not supposed to rock. But for this example, we have lots of space. So imagine this, okay? The piston is being pushed by the spring forward, but the sector gear is trying to pull it backwards. So there's a force, okay, trying to push opposite direction as the sector gear is spinning. Now, it's not a problem if the piston is like sitting right in the middle of the sector gear, something like this, okay? Like a perfect 100% contact right in the middle, centered. But if you shim it wrong, or for some reason the sector gear, due to vibrations or whatever, it's actually rocking laterally, right? For example, it's more towards this side, and this side has a lot of space, okay? Something like this. Then in this situation, you could be looking at the piston sitting halfway on the gear. So something like this, right? Something like this. What could happen is, oh crap. Yeah, this could happen. So what could happen is when it's spinning this way and it being pushed this side, being pushed forward, and it's trying to pull backwards, then if you have too much space on either side, the gear might be having like a force, an uneven force, to be pushed this side, in this direction, okay? So it's sort of like a slanted direction. Now, this is exaggerated because in a gearbox, this is not going to be so visually obvious, okay? In a gearbox, it's more like you're getting like a pressure on the bushing from two different directions. So it's if it's like, you know, twisted in this direction, then it won't, the gear itself won't be like this, but it's actually pushing the bushing, okay, in that direction and this direction. So pushing this side this direction and pushing this side this direction. So what can happen over time, especially if you have like sustained operation for, you know, really high speed, you are actually increasing the wear and tear of the bushing on that side and this side. So what happened to my gearbox is exactly that. It was applying pressure to bushing unevenly, okay, to this direction, and then it ended up just couldn't take it anymore. It just broke off, okay, it just snapped. So having proper shimming on each gear, okay, is very, very important because it reduces the lateral movement of the gears so that it doesn't have that kind of strange sort of force applied, like unintended forces applied onto the bushing or unintended forces applied onto the piston or whatever. Proper shimming will make sure that every part is working as it is intended, okay? So in this little guide, I am going to show you my method of how to shim a gearbox. There are plenty of shimming guides out there, and I really encourage everyone to go and check them out as well, because there's always something that you can borrow from everyone to sort of make it your own way of doing it. But I actually did that as well, so this is sort of like a culmination of all those, you know, years of trial and error and also learning from others and stuff. So this is my way of doing it. You don't have to follow it 100%, but it's definitely, you know, tried and tested, so to speak. So anyway, so let's get started. Now today I'm going to do it like this, okay? I'm going to do it through two different gearboxes. Now the reason for this is that this is much better in showing you guys how each gear sits with each other, whereas this one, it's more for the final step of having the sector gear lined up with the piston. So this is the very, very last step. So let's get started with the bottom half first. So all the tips in my Gel Blaster tips video apply in this shimming video, okay? So let's go step by step in the shimming process. Now the very first thing you really need to do, let's start from a completely empty gearbox, okay? No wiring, no trigger assembly, nothing, okay? Just completely empty, not even the bushings, because the very first step is the bushings, okay? So first of all, you apply glue onto the edge, this edge, okay? This wider edge of the bushing, okay? You apply glue to it, and then you put it into these holes, obviously, but make sure that you push them in, okay, as much as possible and evenly, okay? Because for some gearboxes, okay, the bushing, the height of the bushing can be different, okay? So for the FB gearbox, it's basically flush with the ring. Okay, it's basically flush, but then different bushings can also have a different height. So you need to make sure that you're pushing it in as much as possible so that it's actually sitting in this hole correctly, okay? So I'm going to give you an example. So I'm not going to do gluing for my bushings, but, you know, apply the glue first, okay? So this is what it should look like for the FB 3.0, but for the war interest, okay, so on this side it looks fairly flush, right? But on the other side, this one in particular is sitting below the war interest gearbox, okay? It's a bit below, it's about 0.1 to 0.2 millimeters below, okay? So that's why it's very important that you apply enough pressure to push it all the way through, not like breaking it. You won't be able to break it anyway, but push it and make sure that it sits correctly inside the hole, okay? Now, after that, let the glue settle, okay? Then we go to the next step. Okay, so the second step to the shimming process is the start of the actual shimming process. So my principle for shimming an entirely new gearbox is to always start from the bevel gear and the power source. These are the two gears and locations that you must start first on. If you start anywhere else, you're going to have a problem with adjusting motor height and doing everything else, stuff like that. So start from the bevel gear, pinion, and also motor height. So I'm going to show you exactly how to do it. Now with the V2 gearbox, the bevel gear actually sits upside down like this. So what we have to do is actually start from the bottom of the bevel gear. So let's do it from this side of the gear first, gearbox. Okay, so first thing you need to do is just put it in place and just spin it. If you hear any sort of friction like this, put one shim on it, starting with 0.1. So always start from the smallest unit, okay? So start with 0.1 until it does not have any sound, okay, when you spin it. So let's start from it, 0.1. And like I said before in my other tips, always apply the bushing grease onto the shimming, in between shimming, and when you put it on here as well, always apply some bushing grease so that, you know, it's smooth and stuff. So here, I've applied 0.1. So when you spin it now, it doesn't have any friction sound, okay, see? There's no sound anymore. The reason for that is if you actually hear anything, okay, any sound, then your gear is actually rubbing against something on the gearbox. So this is especially important for nylon gearboxes, because Gel Blaster mostly use nylon gearboxes, and nylon is a very soft material. It's easy to deform, and a lot of the time the molds from the factory is not very accurate, so it's prone to have like bits and pieces sticking out in the wrong side. So you need to do this very important step just to make sure it doesn't have any friction on the wrong places. So right now you can't hear anything, so that's done. Okay, you don't need to apply any more shims for now. Once this is done, now we apply the motor to this. But how do we do that? We need to make sure that we have a pistol grip in place, okay? And we have to install it, okay? We have to install it. Now, the proper way of doing it is actually to do it as a closed gearbox, okay? Because if you don't close it, your gear is actually prone to doing this. Okay? So it's much better to actually have it closed. Okay? When you do this. Okay, and also make sure that you install all the screws on. But for the purpose of showing you guys what I mean with the motor height first, I'm gonna do it as an open sort of thing, and I'll show you what I mean, but always do it closed. Always do it closed. So first of all, you have to install the grip like you always do normally, okay? So let's install this grip. Now, the one thing you need to keep in mind when you install the grip is that it's almost always a different height, okay? For the gearbox and the pistol grip, like where it meets, it might not always be like this, because sometimes the receiver is different and then it might push the grip away from the gearbox a little bit. So what we're trying to do is to have the pinion gear meet at 90% with the bevel gear, okay? And then we lock that down in place, and then we just unattach the grip. But then once you put everything back together and then you put the grip back in, screw it in as much as you can so that it's like fully touching the gearbox just like it is now, so that, you know, your motor height is not that different. And you just run it, you know. If it has strange sounds, you can still adjust it, but most likely it's not going to happen, especially if you have a FB gearbox. But anyway, if you have this set up, okay, again, a reminder, this is supposed to be a closed gearbox, okay, but this is just to show you what I mean when I do this thing. But anyway, so let's put the motor in, okay, just install it like you normally do. Make sure this is loose, so this is already pre-set up, so I'm gonna undo it. Okay, so let me bring this better lighting. Let's do some better lighting. Okay, so this part is very crucial, okay? So, can you guys see, okay, here? Alright, this is what you want to look at, okay? The bevel gear and the pinion gear, okay? So, hold on. Yep, here we go. So, as you can see, it's not meeting, okay, at 90%. This is not a proper contact for the pinion gear and the bevel gear, okay? So this is not proper. Okay, so there's still a lot of movement from the bevel gear. So what we want to do is to adjust the motor height, okay, to make sure that it's actually meeting the bevel gear properly. So let's adjust the motor height now. Okay, so as you can see, the pinion gear is pushing up. Okay, so this is sort of the contact that you want between the bevel gear and the pinion gear, okay? So you can actually push it up a bit more, but that's pretty much it. That's as much as you want it to have. Now, one thing that you want to check for once you have the motor height set up, okay? And this is something that you can only check with a closed gearbox, which I'll demonstrate now. And that is how the pinion gear meets the bevel gear laterally. So let's close the gearbox first. So now we have this set up, closed gearbox, pistol grip installed, everything installed in place. And from the last step, the motor height has been adjusted. Okay, so the pinion gear is sitting at the right location, supposedly 90% of the contact with the bevel gear. Okay, so all that was set up from the last step. Now what we need to check is the movement of the bevel gear. So as you can see, it still wiggles a little bit. This isn't too bad, but we want to reduce this movement even more. Not to the point where it's like completely stuck, but we want to reduce this movement. So by increasing the height of this bevel gear, right? So increasing the height like this, it will reduce this movement, because what you're looking at right now is these triangular teeth meeting with the pinion teeth, not completely. So you're talking about maybe, I don't know, 70% of the height of the pinion gear and the bevel gear meeting. But this because it's a triangle, it sort of still has room to wiggle a little bit. So you want to reduce that amount of space in between the triangles, so to speak. And by adding like more shims to this side, it will reduce the movement of this bevel gear, okay? This side, this way. Okay, so that is the final step for this bevel gear in terms of shimming. Okay, this is what you want to sort of avoid. If you have too much movement, it's going to ruin your setup as well. So you want to reduce this movement as much as possible. The rest of the shimming for this particular gear would be done from this side, okay, at a later stage. But right now, you want to increase shimming on this side to reduce this movement, okay? It doesn't have to be completely stuck, not being able to move, but you want to reduce it as much as possible, okay, so that it doesn't wiggle as loosely. You know, this is quite loose right now, okay? So, yeah, let's move on to the next step. Okay, so now that we have set up the bevel gear and the motor height, we can now go back to this side of the gearbox and set up the rest of the gears. Okay, so one thing to keep in mind though is that when we set up the shimming, okay, we don't want to go too tight. Okay, when it goes too tight, it's also too much friction on the gears, so we want it to be just right. Okay, it can't be less has to be just right. So anyway, so let's get started on this side. So before we transfer the bevel gear back to this side of the gearbox, we need to start applying the spur gear first. So going back to the first step of putting a gear onto the gearbox, we need to sort of put it into the gearbox and spin it to see if it has any friction with any part of the gearbox, and then if it does, we add shims to it. So that's obviously, the spur gear rubbing against this bushing right here, okay? So we need to apply 0.1, okay? Always go in increments of 0.1. You don't want to be too much. Just go in increments of 0.1. Okay, just add to the thing, spin it again. Yep, still sound. So let's do it again. 0.1. Wow, this is really okay. Just one more. Okay. Okay, this is 0.4 now. Together, I mean, 0.4. Okay, so this is sort of the sound that I think when it closes, like when the gearbox is closed, it might not produce that sound anymore. So it's always good to close the gearbox to check how it actually spins, because the gears are prone to, yeah, it's still spinning. The gears are prone to do this if you just, go too lazy. So always close the gearbox to check how it actually sounds like. So we're going to replace these with 0.3 and 0.2, so that it becomes a 0.5. 0.3, so as it says here, 0.3. Okay, that's a 0.2. That's a 0.2, and this is a 0.3. Okay. FB shims have the actual numbers on the shims. It's really good. Okay, so this is the sound you want. Okay, you don't hear any friction. So the height is at 0.5. So when you close the gearbox, this is what you want. Nothing. Okay, you don't want any noise coming from it. So after you're done with your spur gear, the sector gear, no, spur gear, put the bevel gear on. Okay, and what you want to check now is how the teeth are meeting each other, and also the space, like this surface where it's scratching against this part. So as you can see, there's still a bit of room in there. So what we need to do now is to check with the gearbox closed, see if that's still the case. Spin it. If you hear friction, then you need to adjust the height. So that was definitely the spur gear and the bevel gear scratching against each other. So we add one more shim to the bevel gear and do the process again. Okay, it's always good to close the gearbox. And when you close your gearbox, okay, make sure you're actually doing all the screws in, because some gearboxes, especially nylon, they're prone to deforming. Okay, so when you're just holding on to it like this, it might actually apply uneven pressure, and it doesn't like sort of recreate the actual environment that the gears are actually positioning themselves. So always put the screws back on. This bottom half of the gearbox just so happened to be very perfect. So, and also I don't have the screws, I don't have any more spare screws, so I'm not sort of screwing them in. But the proper way of doing it is screwing all the things in first, and then you do the check the shimming. Okay, so there's still some friction to it. Add one more. So always go by increments of 0.1. Okay, always go in 0.1 increments. So again, close the gearbox, install the screws. Okay, so this is what you want. Okay, no scratching. So those two gears are set. Now we move on to the sector gear, which is the final gear before we hit the piston. So here it is. I have a very unique looking gear. This is not something that you can use for gel blasters, unfortunately. But anyway, I have a 9.1 ratio, so this is like dual sector. It's actually quite interesting. But anyway, let's put the thing in. What you want to watch out for is this. So you don't want the sector gear to scratch against this surface and this surface. So as you can see here, the after I put the sector gear in, it's sort of like lobbed to one side, and that's because the height is already insufficient to be on top of the spur gear. So for the spur gear, we apply, I think, roughly 0.5 millimeter. We can do that for the sector gear and see what that does first. Okay, so let's apply 0.5 to it. Yep, okay, so now if you look at it again, it sort of sits straight now. So second thing we want to check is, first of all, how other surfaces meeting each other. So here, as you can see, there's a bit of space in there. That's good. And let's spin this side. So there's a bit of space here as well, so that's fine. Let's close the gearbox. Oh crap. Let's close the gearbox and see how it sounds when you spin it. If it doesn't have any friction, then we're good to set the outer side of the shims. So there is still friction. So once we set the gearbox, like close the gearbox, you can see that these are actually touching. So we need to increase the height of the sector gear again. Let's go by 1. Okay, always go by 0.1. So this is what I mean by, you know, having to apply the bushing grease so that the shims don't fall apart when you take the gears out. You know, it just stays on. Okay, so still a bit of friction, so you check the space. Yep, it's still the teeth of the actual sector is not really touching the surface of the spur gear, but the bottom level is. So as you can see, it's still scratching against each other. So let's just put one more, 0.1, see how it goes. One more, just one more. Okay. So this is perfect now. So now you're just hearing the sound of the teeth meeting and, you know, impacting each other. It's not like scratching or anything. So this is great. So that's basically this bottom level of the shims set. Okay, except for the bevel gear, which already has a shim on it. Now, with the bevel gear, it's very important that when you adjust the height of the rest of the gears, you don't add more shims to this side of the bevel gear, because that has been set already with the pinion gear and also the motor height. So you should not touch this at all. Okay, you can only add to these guys, and also if you still need to increase the height of this one, you add it to this side. Okay, the bevel gear, but don't do it to this side anymore. Okay, so let's see how much we need to add in terms of space. So going back to closing the gearbox. Okay, so now that we have all the shims on this side done, what you want to do is check how much more you need to add to this side to make sure that it doesn't have any more lateral movement for the gear. So now that we're spinning it, doesn't have any scratching sound, so you want to, you know, sort of like ride it to the sort of like a vertical position, and then you just want to check, okay, if there are any more lateral movement to any of these. So if you want to check for the bevel gear, you just need to push the pin, you know, just push the pin to see if it pops. It pops out. Okay, so you need to do like sort of a rough guess of how much it pops out. So let's try the sector gear. The sector gear has, I don't know, like 0.2 roughly. Spur gear has no movement, so that's good. Yeah, spur gear has no movement. So what we need to do now is to add more shims to the bevel gear and the spur gear, and the sector gear. Yeah, the bevel gear I think is about, whoa, that's a lot, 0.2. Okay, so let's add to it. Okay, so for the sector gear, we don't need to touch the bottom anymore, so we just add to this side. Okay, we don't need to touch that. These fine tip tweezers are really good for doing this sort of work, so really recommend everyone to get a pair. Okay, so my guess was the sector gear needed 0.2. Okay, we can close it and check again. Okay, we'll do the bevel gear later. Yeah, so there's no lateral movement to it. Yeah, okay, this is fine. So we just add the last shim to the bevel gear, and then we're done. The bevel gear actually, I think, needed around 0.2 to 0.3 in terms of shims, but I'm completely out, so let's just assume I have it. Let's just assume I have it. So here it is, okay? So close the gearbox and then spin the gears to ensure that it doesn't have any sounds to it. No lateral movement of the gears, okay? No lateral movements. So just check. For the sector gear, you don't want any lateral movement. Yeah, it doesn't have any. Spur gear doesn't have any. So that is the 3 gears all done. But this is not the final step. The final step is to check how these gears interact with the piston, because the piston, if it doesn't sit right with the sector gear, is actually a point of disaster as well. So let's transfer these gears to the actual gearbox with the piston. Okay, so this is like sort of, you know, open view for it. So let's transfer the gears over. Okay, so now that we've put all the gears onto this complete gearbox, okay, all you need to do is like have this really simple setup. You just have a cylinder and a piston in it. You don't even need to have a cylinder head, actually. Just have the piston and the cylinder in it, and you just slide out the piston, okay, so that it sits on the rail. Oh crap! So that it sits on the rail properly, you know, in the right orientation, so it's straight, and then sort of like in a way meeting the other side of the gearbox rail as well. So not like this or not like the other side, just, you know, straight, right? And then you push it out, okay, and just check, you know, just spin the sector gear and see how it meets the teeth of the piston. So if you have something like this, okay, this is really good contact already. So you just keep spinning it, you know, okay. This is really good. So this is like 100% of the sector gear is touching the piston, which is great. Okay, this is what you want. This is exactly what you want for the contact. Okay, now the more ideal situation, okay, let's pull this out, have a look. Okay, so right now it's basically doing something like this. It was like full contact from the sector gear to the piston, but this is actually to one side of the piston. The most ideal situation is to have the sector gear in sort of like contacting like this, more towards the center of the piston. But then this is sometimes impossible, because it really depends on how the gears are machined and stuff like that, and sometimes it just doesn't allow enough space for the sector gear to sort of like contact the piston in this sense. So this is actually fine as long as it has full contact. This is pretty good already. So once you have checked that the piston and the gears are perfectly aligned, touching each other, you know, full contact, everything, and as best as you can to set up, you know, all the shimming and stuff, it doesn't have any strange frictional sound or whatever, then you can close the gearbox, okay, put it back into a receiver. You don't have to put the upper receiver or the handguard yet, but you can basically assemble the bottom receiver. Okay, this is the very important part. Assemble the gearbox with the bottom receiver, and then you put the grip back in, okay? Because sometimes what happens is, if you look at this side, all right, when we did the motor height, okay, that was without the receiver. It's possible that some receivers might do this to your grip and gearbox assembly. It might add a bit of space to it. If this happens, then it will mess up with your motor height setup, okay? So you need to make sure that you have the bottom receiver assembled with the gearbox. Then you attach the pistol grip to it as tight as you can, okay? So that's, you know, pulling tightly. So you want to recreate how you did the motor height setup to as much as possible. Then you put the motor back in, put everything back in, and then you just run it. Listen for sounds. If you have a very high screeching sound, adjust the motor height again, little by little, to see if that sound disappears. If it disappears, then you've got your new motor height, which you can make it permanent, which you can go back and use my other tip, and that is use the thread locking glue to lock this screw, okay, so that it doesn't undo itself during vibrations and all that stuff. And that's the important part, the last part for shimming and setting up your gearbox. Going back through everything as a sort of like a summary, the very first step of shimming your gearbox or setting up your gearbox is to glue every bushing to the gearbox and also push it down as much as possible so that it's sitting correctly inside the gearbox. Okay, then the second step is to set up the bevel gear on this side of the gearbox. Okay, every time you set the gear in, make sure that you're spinning it so that it doesn't have any sound, or you listen for sounds and stuff. If you hear any friction or anything, add shims to it. When you add shims, add in increments of 0.1 millimeter. Okay, once you don't hear any more friction. Okay, and then what you need to do is to do the next step. That is the motor height. You close the gearbox. Okay, don't do it like I did. You close the gearbox. Okay, you install all the screws. Okay, so that the gearbox is closed properly. You put in the pistol grip, put in the motor, and then you through some opening, you watch for how the pinion gear meets the bevel gear. Okay, one shortcut to that, okay, and it can still be a sort of a proper step, and that is you can still do what I did, sort of like a half open gearbox, and then you attach the pistol grip like that. Once you adjust the motor height, and then you put the gearbox back together, okay, and then you just do some fine tweaking of the motor height to see how the pinion gear touches the bevel gear. Okay, so the contact is at least 90% contact, but no more than 95%. You don't want 100% because it's just gonna, you know, create too much friction and stuff like that. So 90 to 95% of pinion gear touching the bevel gear is ideal. Okay, so once you have all that set up, then you go back to this side of the gearbox. You set up the spur gear first. Okay, again, you spin it, listen for you know, any friction or whatever. If it doesn't have friction, then you put the bevel gear back into place. Then when you put this back into place, you adjust the height of these this gear, okay, so that it's not scratching against the surface of the spur gear. Okay, once you're done with that, then you can put in the sector gear again, observing how these two areas are interacting with this sector gear. Okay, so every time you sort of add a new gear, right, close the gearbox, spin it, see if it has any sounds, strange sounds. If it doesn't, then you can move on to the next one. The last one, the sector gear, is definitely the one that is the most important. You put it in, add shims to it, close the gearbox, spin it. You hear sounds, open the gearbox, add shims. Every time you add an extra shim, close the gearbox, spin it, listen for sounds. Okay, it's tedious, it's time consuming, but very, very important. Okay, so you have to do it. So once you have the bottom, okay, level of the shims all set up, then you do this level, okay? But never touch the bevel gear from here on. Okay, that's already set up, so you don't need to touch that. What you want to do is adjust the height of the bevel gear through this side and adjust the height of these two through this side. Okay, don't touch anything else. So yeah, so it should look like this. You close the gearbox, okay, and then you just shift everything. Okay, push the pins of the gears from outside the gearbox through the bushing. Okay, so you close it like this. Okay, you push from this side. Okay, you push from this side and you push each gear and see how much it pops out from here. You basically sort of do a rough guess, 0.2, 0.3, whatever, and then you just add the shims to these areas and the bottom of the bevel gear to make sure that there's no longer any lateral movement. But again, every time you close the gearbox, okay, every time you add a shim, okay, make sure you install all the screws, okay, install all the screws so that the gearbox is fit together correctly. Because sometimes, especially if you're too happy with, adding shims, you might be adding too much. When you add too much, you close the gearbox when it applies the correct pressure. Because when you close the gearbox, that's basically the actual environment that the gears are operating in. So once you close the gearbox with all the screws installed, you spin it. If you find it very difficult to spin, that means you would know that you have added too many shims to it. So then you have to start taking it back out. Okay, so do it step by step. That's why it's very important to do it at increments of 0.1 millimeter. Okay, it's very tedious, it's very time consuming. Again, I have to stress this, it's very important that you do it like this. Otherwise you could be scratching your head and saying, why is it not spinning properly? Why is it still having all these noise or whatever? But anyway, so after you're done, okay, shimming these three gears, there's no lateral movement anymore. Not too much, not too little, just right. Then you set up the cylinder with the piston, okay, and you check on how the gear meets the piston, okay. This is acceptable, okay? So this is like 100% of the sector gear touching the piston, okay? Ideal is to touch the middle of the piston, so sort of like this, not like flush, like just now, like this, but more like sort of towards the middle of the piston teeth. But this isn't that necessary in a sense, because for gel blasters, our power level don't really go up as high as the airsoft AEG. So 100% of the sector gear with no lateral movement touching the piston is very good already. So this is already very good. So once you have checked the piston, how it interacts with the sector gear, okay, if it's not touching properly, then you have to go back and redo all the heights and stuff. But if it's touching between like 90% to 100%, you're good, okay? So you're pretty good on that side. Then you close everything, okay? You close everything, put the whole gearbox back into your bottom receiver, install your pistol grip, install the motor and the motor adjustment, cap and stuff like that. Install everything, run it. Dude, that's your final check. You run it. Listen for sounds. If you hear any high screeching sounds, okay, adjust the height of the motor in small increments, okay? Once you don't hear that sound, lock down that height with some thread locking glue. Just do it around the rim, okay, of that screw. And then just let it settle. And that is basically done. Okay, that's all the steps you need to go through to make sure that you shimmed everything properly. Okay, now there are some commenters who ask me like why the nylon sort of piston gets destroyed and stuff like that. So these are some extra rules to keep in mind. When you are using different kinds of material, okay, make sure that your piston material and your sector gear material is at least the same. So if you're going to mix and match, for example, I know some guy who would use a metal bevel gear with nylon spur and sector gear. So in that sense, he would use a nylon teeth piston. Okay, always have the same material with the sector gear and the piston. Otherwise, it's going to destroy each other, especially when you have metallic gears with nylon piston. Metal gears are heavy, and as it spins, there's a momentum created. So the motor, when it sort of stops operating, it will sort of do like a braking sort of effect. It will try to stop the gear, but then the gear would still sort of spin a little bit. That little bit of movement is enough to sort of soften or destroy nylon material if it's on the piston. So make sure you have the same material as the piston and the sector gear. Okay, it's possible that it will work with each other. Okay, it's very possible, but in the long run, it's better to have the same material, because through my experience and many of the other people's, sort of like show and tell and all that stuff, that's basically the consensus that we have come up with, and that is the same material from the sector gear and the piston is very, very important. All right, guys, so that was basically my guide to how to shim and set up your gearbox from scratch, from the ground up. Now, that was a very long video, but I can assure you, if you do it properly, it will take even longer, but it's worth it, because it will make sure that your gearbox will last longer and more reliable and not as prone to damage and all that stuff. So if you are into modding your gearbox to much higher level, like M100 and beyond, this is very important that you get every step of it right. Okay, so it's tedious that you have to check how the gears run, and you have to do it through like closing the gearbox, assembling it properly, screwing all the screws, but you have to do it because you are trying to recreate the actual operating environment of the gears by installing all the screws in. Okay, anyway, so that's it for this video. If you guys have any extra questions that I did not mention, any queries, whatever, please feel free to email me. I'll always answer your questions as much as I can. And yeah, if you have any good ideas, also mention it in the comments. And last but not least, I encourage everyone to go out there and check out other shimming videos to see what other people, like what sort of tricks other people use, because at the end of the day, it's a cumulative sort of collective of knowledge that we put it together to make everything better. So it's also a community effort. So a lot of community members were correcting me on certain facts and figures and stuff like that, and I really appreciate that. So that's very important, because Joe Blaster is a growing sport, but it's also very young, so it needs that sort of collective effort to sort of like make it better. So anyway, go out there and check out other videos as well. If you guys find any other tricks or you guys have any other comments, please leave it down below. And yeah, that's it for this video. I'll see you in the next one. Peace, guys.